This is not how industrial collapse announces itself. There are no dramatic speeches, no emergency declarations, no cameras positioned outside factory gates as the last shift clocks out. Just a memo from General Motors headquarters, a restructuring plan, language carefully chosen to sound temporary. Oshawa assembly plant shifting to reduced operations. Hundreds of workers receiving notices. The machinery that built vehicles for generations now running on partial capacity or sitting silent. The official explanation arrives quickly. Electric vehicle transition challenges, market adjustments, operational efficiency requirements. The language of corporate necessity designed to make this sound inevitable, technical, beyond politics. And most people accept this framing because it aligns with what they have been told to expect. The automotive industry is changing. Old plants must adapt or close. This is progress demanding sacrifice. But this is where the public misreads the structural pattern. The General Motors layoffs in Oshawa are not the result of electric vehicle policies failing or Canadian workers becoming uncompetitive. What is happening in Ontario right now is the visible consequence of a trade architecture that was deliberately restructured to punish Canadian manufacturing and reward American facilities. The layoffs are not a business decision. They are a policy outcome. The Trump administration's 25% tariff on vehicles manufactured in Canada and imported to the United States changed the fundamental economics of where General Motors builds cars for the North American market. When a vehicle assembled in Oshawa faces a 25% tax upon crossing into the United States, while the same vehicle assembled in Michigan crosses freely, the choice becomes structural rather than strategic. General Motors did not decide that Canadian workers were less productive. They calculated that paying 25% more to sell Canadian-built vehicles in American markets was economically impossible. So production shifts south, not because American facilities are better, but because they are not penalized for existing. This is where leverage quietly changes hands. For decades, automotive manufacturing across the Canada-United States border operated on the assumption of relatively frictionless movement. Components crossed the border 7, sometimes 11 times during this production of a single vehicle. The efficiency of this integration made North American automotive manufacturing globally competitive. The tariff structure imposed in February 2025 did not merely increase costs. It fundamentally rewrote the logic of where manufacturing could occur. If your vehicle is taxed at 25% when leaving Canada, you stop building vehicles in Canada. The math is not complicated, and the workers receiving layoff notices in Oshawa are living through the consequences of that math. But here is what makes this moment structurally significant. The official explanations being offered for these layoffs deliberately obscure the policy decisions that caused them. When General Motors or government officials describe these job losses as the result of electric vehicle transition challenges, they are performing misdirection. They are treating the symptom as the cause. Electric vehicle policies did not close production lines in Oshawa. American tariffs did. This distinction matters because it determines what responses are possible and what responses are considered legitimate. If the problem is defined as technological transition or market forces, then the solution is framed as adaptation, retraining, accepting the new reality. Workers are told they need new skills for new industries. The responsibility for adjustment falls entirely on those losing their livelihoods. But if the problem is defined accurately as trade policy designed to hollow out Canadian manufacturing capacity, then entirely different responses become not just possible, but necessary. This is where Canada's economic power remains fundamentally misunderstood, including by many Canadians themselves. The conventional narrative treats Canada as the smaller economy, the junior partner, the nation that must accept whatever terms the United States dictates because there are no alternatives. Canadian workers losing their jobs to American trade policy often frame their situation as inevitable rather than constructed. They have been taught to see themselves as powerless, but the actual structure of automotive trade tells a different story. Canada is the single largest export market for American manufactured vehicles. The automotive plants in Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee depend entirely on Canadian customers purchasing hundreds of thousands of vehicles annually. The entire economic model of American automotive manufacturing assumes continued access to Canadian markets. This dependency creates leverage that Canada has historically refused to use. Canadian automotive policy for decades has operated under the assumption that maintaining good relations with American manufacturers required accepting subordinate status. When companies chose to close Canadian facilities and expand American ones, Canadian governments offered subsidies to convince them to reconsider. When American trade policies disadvantaged Canadian manufacturing, Canadian negotiators sought exemptions rather than imposing costs on American manufacturers. This approach treated leverage as something Canada did not possess, but the current situation has clarified what leverage actually looks like. If American tariffs make it economically impossible to manufacture vehicles in Canada for sale in the United States, then Canadian policy can make it economically impossible to sell American manufactured vehicles in Canada. The structure is symmetrical, the dependencies run both directions. The difference is that the United States has been willing to weaponize trade policy, while Canada has treated such actions as unthinkable. The question now is whether Canadian policy will continue treating retaliation as unthinkable, while Canadian workers pay the price for that restraint. The VIN strategy represents one possible response. Every vehicle manufactured in North America carries a vehicle identification number that indicates where it was assembled. Vehicles built in the United States begin with VIN codes that identify American facilities. Vehicles built in Canada carry Canadian facility codes. Canadian consumers making purchasing decisions can identify where vehicles were manufactured and can choose to purchase vehicles built in Canada or Mexico rather than vehicles built in the United States. If this behavior occurred at scale, if Canadian automotive purchases systematically avoided American manufactured vehicles, the economic impact on American facilities would be immediate and substantial. This is not a boycott organized by government policy. It is consumer behavior responding to structural incentives. American automotive plants that depend on Canadian market access would face collapsing sales. The political pressure on American policymakers from constituencies experiencing economic damage would mount. And unlike government-imposed trade barriers, consumer preferences are extraordinarily difficult to challenge through trade dispute mechanisms. Canada would not be violating any trade agreement by its citizens choosing to purchase vehicles manufactured in Canada. The decision would be entirely at the consumer level, responding to information publicly available through VIN codes. But implementing such a strategy requires overcoming the psychological patterns that have defined Canadian economic behavior for generations. Canadian consumers have been conditioned to treat American products as default choices. The automotive market in Canada has operated for decades on the assumption that American brands in manufacturing were simply the natural order. Choosing a vehicle based on where it was assembled requires a fundamental shift in how purchasing decisions are made. The question is whether the Oshawa layoffs represent sufficient provocation to trigger that shift. Early indicators suggest something is changing in Canadian consumer psychology, though whether it reaches critical mass remains uncertain. Canadian automotive forums increasingly include references to VIN checking and manufacturing location as purchase criteria. Dealerships report conversations with customers, specifically asking about Canadian-built vehicle availability. The information is spreading through networks that operate independently of government messaging. This is how structural reordering begins, not through official policy announcements, but through distributed decisions that collectively reshape market dynamics. If Canadian automotive purchases shift even 15% away from American manufactured vehicles, the economic impact on American facilities becomes severe. The margins in automotive manufacturing are thin enough that relatively small volume changes determine facility profitability. Plants operating at reduced capacity face the same fixed costs, meaning revenue declines translate directly into losses. And once facilities begin closing in the United States due to Canadian market access problems, the political pressure to reconsider tariff policies becomes unavoidable. But the VN strategy represents only one dimension of how Canada could respond. The deeper structural response involves reconsidering the entire assumption that Canadian automotive manufacturing must serve American markets, or serve no one. Canada's automotive market represents approximately 2 million vehicle sales annually. This is large enough to support substantial domestic production if that production is oriented toward Canadian buyers rather than American exports. The facilities currently facing reduced operations could operate at full capacity, serving Canadian demand if policy frameworks prioritize domestic market access. This reorientation would require accepting that integration with American automotive supply chains is no longer economically viable under current trade policies. Canadian facilities would produce vehicles for Canadian buyers. American facilities would produce vehicles for American buyers. The cross-border supply chains that once made North American automotive manufacturing efficient would be replaced by parallel systems optimized for domestic markets. The short-term costs of such a transition would be substantial. Decades of integration cannot be unwound without disruption. But the long-term implications point toward greater Canadian control over manufacturing decisions and reduced vulnerability to American trade policy shifts. And this reorientation opens possibilities that have been considered unthinkable under the assumptions of North American integration. If Canadian automotive manufacturing is being rebuilt around domestic market priorities, then the question of which manufacturers participate becomes entirely open. Chinese automotive manufacturers seeking access to developed markets without facing American trade barriers could find Canadian partnerships strategically valuable. European manufacturers already operating in Canada could expand production for domestic markets without concern for American tariff structures. The Canadian automotive market becomes not a subordinate component of American manufacturing, but an independent space where companies compete for access under Canadian policy frameworks. This represents a fundamental reordering of how automotive manufacturing is structured in North America. For 80 years, the assumption has been continental integration under American leadership. Canadian facilities existed to serve American markets. Canadian policy adapted to American priorities. Canadian workers accepted that their employment depended on decisions made in Detroit or Washington. That assumption is now being tested by the consequences of American trade policy. And the test is revealing that alternatives exist, even if they require abandoning frameworks that have defined Canadian economic strategy for generations. History does not reverse because it is misunderstood. The workers receiving layoff notices in Oshawa will not get their jobs back because someone explains the policy origins of their situation. The facilities going silent will not restart because Canadian consumers begin checking Vine codes. The damage is immediate and personal and will not be undone by structural analysis. But the pattern being established now will determine whether future manufacturing decisions treat Canada as expendable or essential. And that determination will be made not through negotiations or diplomatic engagement, but through the economic costs imposed on those who thought Canadian subordination could be assumed rather than maintained. By the time this is acknowledged, it will already be normal.